When a name like Joyce Meyer comes up, most people think of faith, inspiration, and powerful sermons that touch millions. But now, shocking accusations have surfaced, claims of fraud and deception that are shaking her reputation to the core. Could one of the most recognizable figures in Christian ministry have been hiding secrets all along? The truth behind these allegations will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Joyce Meyer's story didn't begin with stadiums full of people or best-selling books stacked in bookstores. It began in a quiet, painful place that most people would never choose to share publicly. As a young girl, she endured years of abuse at the hands of her own father. It was the kind of trauma that leaves wounds so deep they seem impossible to heal. For a long time, Joyce lived with those scars in silence, carrying the weight of anger, shame, and confusion. She has often spoken about how those years shaped her, leaving her with walls so high that trusting anyone seemed almost impossible. But in the middle of that brokenness, something began to shift. Joyce found faith, though it wasn't a sudden transformation. It was a long, hard process of learning to trust in God, of wrestling with questions about her worth and her future. Slowly, she began to believe that her past didn't have to dictate the rest of her life. She often described moments of prayer where she felt a spark of hope, a sense that God could take even the most broken pieces and use them for something greater. In those early years, Joyce wasn't standing on a stage. She was leading small Bible studies in her community, talking to groups of women about the struggles she knew firsthand: anger, bitterness, and the pain of feeling unworthy. There were no lights or cameras, just folding chairs, Bibles, and her unpolished honesty. And yet, people listened. They weren't drawn in because she was perfect. They listened because she was real. She didn't try to hide the messy parts of her life, and that rawness made her message resonate deeply. As word spread, those living room gatherings turned into larger meetings. People told friends, who told more friends, and soon her voice was reaching further than she had ever imagined. What started with sharing her pain slowly became a calling. Joyce began to see that the very thing that had once threatened to destroy her, her trauma, was the very thing God was using to connect her with others. Her testimony of survival and healing wasn't just her story anymore. It became a source of hope for thousands who carried their own hidden wounds. From those humble beginnings, Joyce Meyer took her first steps into ministry. She hadn't set out to build an empire or write books that would sit on bestseller lists. She simply wanted to show people that healing was possible, that faith could rewrite even the darkest chapters of life. And as she stood in front of more and more people, her past no longer defined her as a victim. It became the foundation of a message that would one day reach the world: that brokenness can be turned into purpose. As Joyce Meyer's ministry grew, so did her visibility. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, she wasn't just a preacher speaking at small gatherings anymore. She was a household name in Christian circles. Her voice was heard on television and radio across the country. Her books were stacked high in Christian bookstores, and her conferences filled stadiums with tens of thousands of people. Her story of pain, healing, and faith gave her credibility, and her bold, straightforward preaching style made her stand out. But along with all the success came something that started to trouble people: the wealth and lifestyle that surrounded her ministry. At first, the whispers were small. People noticed that she wasn't just living like an ordinary pastor's wife. There were reports about expensive clothes, designer shoes, and furnishings that didn't look modest at all. These details could have been overlooked, but as her ministry became a global empire, bringing in tens of millions of dollars each year, journalists and watchdog groups started digging deeper. What they found didn't fit with the image of a ministry that preached humility and simplicity. One of the earliest red flags was the homes. Not one or two modest properties, but multiple multi-million-dollar residences purchased by the ministry for Joyce and her family. These weren't humble parsonages. They were sprawling estates, some with elevators, swimming pools, and garages big enough to hold a fleet of cars. Reports claimed that the ministry had even bought several homes in the same gated community, creating what looked less like ministry housing and more like a private compound. Then came the infamous purchases that hit headlines around the world. In one report, it was revealed that the ministry had spent $23,000, 0 cents, on a marble-topped commode, not a toilet but a fancy cabinet to hold makeup. Another purchase included a $30,000, 0 cents, conference table, along with luxury furnishings that seemed more fitting for a celebrity mansion than a ministry office. These details quickly became symbolic for critics. a shorthand way of pointing out the excess that they believed was funded by donations from ordinary people. The private jet was another sore point. While Joyce and her team explained that the Gulfstream jet was necessary for travel, since she preached all over the world and had a demanding schedule, the optics were hard to ignore. Critics saw it as yet another sign that the ministry was more about luxury than service. For many followers who had sacrificed to give, sometimes scraping together money from tight budgets to support what they believed was God's work, it was difficult to reconcile their giving with the image of a preacher flying privately and living in mansions. These revelations sparked a storm of criticism, not just from skeptics of televangelism, but even from within the Christian community. People started asking questions. Where exactly was the money going? Was the ministry truly focused on spreading the gospel, or was it funding a lifestyle for Joyce and her inner circle? Could someone who preached about humility and trusting God really justify living in such extravagance? In 2007, these questions reached a breaking point when U.S. Senator Chuck Grassley launched a Senate inquiry into 6 major televangelists, Joyce Meyer among them. The investigation wasn't about theology. It was about money. Lawmakers wanted to know whether these ministries were abusing their tax-exempt status and using donations to fund personal luxuries. When the news broke, it sent shockwaves through Christian communities. For Joyce Meyer Ministries, this was the first major public test of their financial transparency. Unlike some others under investigation who refused to cooperate, Joyce Meyer actually complied. She released financial documents, showed records, and even announced changes to how the ministry would operate going forward. She promised that her salary would no longer come directly from donations but from her book royalties and personal business ventures. This move earned her some praise and helped ease the Senate inquiry, which ended without penalties. But for many, the damage was already done. The lavish details had already shaped the public's perception, and once people saw the lifestyle, it was impossible to unsee it. For Joyce's supporters, these revelations were painful but not necessarily disqualifying. Some argued that she had worked hard for her success. They pointed out that her books sold millions of copies, that her conferences drew paying crowds, and that she had every right to benefit from the fruits of her labor. In their view, she wasn't hiding anything. She had built a ministry and a business, and she was enjoying the rewards. To them, her lifestyle was simply evidence that God had blessed her. But for her critics, the issue wasn't whether she had the right to wealth. The issue was whether that wealth contradicted the message she preached. Joyce often told audiences not to cling to material possessions, to focus on spiritual strength rather than worldly gain. Yet, she was living in mansions, wearing designer outfits, and traveling the world on a private jet. The disconnect between message and lifestyle created a sense of betrayal for many. People who had trusted her words began to wonder if those words were really just part of a brand, carefully crafted to keep donations flowing. The controversy also highlighted a deeper problem within the prosperity gospel movement itself. Joyce Meyer, like many prosperity preachers, often linked giving with blessings. The more you give, the more God can bless you, financially, emotionally, or spiritually. For people struggling with debt, illness, or family crises, that message was powerful. It encouraged them to give even when they didn't have much to give, believing that their sacrifice would lead to breakthrough. But when they looked at Joyce's lifestyle, so far removed from their own struggles, it became harder to believe that the promises of prosperity were truly for everyone. Stories began to surface of people who had emptied savings accounts or maxed out credit cards to give to Joyce Meyer Ministries, hoping for a miracle that never came. Some said they gave with joy, believing it was between them and God. Others admitted they felt manipulated afterward, realizing their money may have gone to fund luxury furniture or family estates, rather than directly supporting outreach or charity. These stories added fuel to the criticism and deepened the distrust. Even though Joyce Meyer made efforts to address the concerns, including public statements about changes to her salary and more transparency, the image of extravagance never fully went away. For many, the words marble commode or private jet would forever be associated with her name. It didn't matter how many good works the ministry supported: disaster relief, prison outreach, feeding programs. The lavish lifestyle remained the headline. Over time, Joyce herself acknowledged some of the problems. In later interviews, she admitted that she had made mistakes in how she spoke about money and blessings. She even distanced herself from certain aspects of the prosperity gospel, saying that she no longer agreed with everything she had preached in the past. Those admissions showed humility and growth, and they softened some of the criticism. But for others, the question lingered. Was it genuine repentance or just damage control? What's clear is that the lavish lifestyle became a turning point in how people viewed Joyce Meyer. She was no longer just the survivor who turned her trauma into a powerful message of hope. She was also a symbol of the dangers of mixing faith, money, and fame. Supporters continued to pack her conferences and buy her books, but critics saw her as proof that televangelism had gone too far, that leaders were living in luxury while asking ordinary people to sacrifice. The rising questions about her lifestyle didn't erase her message entirely, but they changed how people heard it. Every time she preached about simplicity, trust, or surrender, there were those who couldn't help but picture the mansions, the jet, and the lavish furniture. It was a shadow that followed her ministry, a reminder that in the world of modern televangelism, words and lifestyle must match, or trust begins to crumble. When people first started giving to Joyce Meyer Ministries, most did it out of faith. They believed their donations would help spread the gospel, fund missions, and bring hope to people in need. Many of them were ordinary folks, single mothers, retirees, families trying to make ends meet. They weren't wealthy donors looking for influence. They were people giving sacrificially, often sending in checks with handwritten prayer requests. For them, giving wasn't just charity, it was an act of worship, a way of showing trust in God. But as the years went on, questions began to surface about whether that trust had been manipulated, whether the line between faith and financial pressure had been crossed. Joyce's preaching style was always bold. She didn't sugarcoat things, and her confidence made people believe she was telling them the truth straight from God's word. But woven into many of her messages was a theme that echoed through televangelism in general: the idea that giving money to the ministry was directly connected to blessings in your life. Sometimes it was framed as sowing a seed. If you give financially, you are planting something God can multiply. Other times it was connected to breakthrough, suggesting that if you sacrificed financially, God would open doors for you in your health, your relationships, or your career. For people struggling in tough situations, that message was powerful. The problem was that over time, some began to feel the message wasn't just encouragement, it was pressure. Former supporters shared stories of how they gave money they didn't really have because they were told, either directly or indirectly, that God would bless them if they did. There were heartbreaking accounts of people maxing out credit cards, dipping into retirement savings, or giving their last dollars because they believed a miracle was just around the corner if they showed enough faith. For many, when the miracle didn't come, the disappointment turned into doubt, and that doubt turned into feelings of betrayal. One story that circulated came from a former employee at the ministry who described answering phones during donation drives. She told of a woman, elderly and crying, who admitted she had nothing left but a little bit on her credit card. She wanted to give it because she had heard that if she donated $1,000, 0 cents, God would return $10,000, 0 cents. The employee said she felt sick taking that payment, knowing the woman was in debt, but also knowing that this was the culture of giving the ministry had cultivated. It wasn't just about generosity anymore. It was about expectation, about giving in hopes of receiving something back. Critics argued that this kind of teaching bordered on manipulation. It wasn't just encouraging faith, it was creating a cycle of guilt and pressure. If someone gave, and their life didn't improve, the message implied it was because they didn't give enough, didn't believe enough, or didn't obey quickly enough. That cycle kept people coming back, trying again, hoping that this time their sacrifice would finally produce the blessing they had been promised. For people already struggling financially, the consequences could be devastating. The Senate investigation into televangelists in 2007 brought even more attention to these concerns. It wasn't just about the expensive furniture, the mansions, or the private jet. It was about the way donations were collected in the first place. Lawmakers wanted to know whether ministries like Joyce Meyer's were exploiting vulnerable people, using emotional appeals and promises of blessings to draw in money that was then used for luxury living. While Joyce's team defended their practices and cooperated with the inquiry, the testimonies of people who felt pressured to give painted a troubling picture. Joyce herself has said over the years that she never meant to mislead anyone. She insisted that giving should be done out of love for God, not out of obligation, and that blessings weren't always financial. But recordings and transcripts of her older sermons show that the link between giving and receiving was often strong and clear. Phrases like, "God will multiply your seed," and "Your breakthrough is waiting," were repeated often enough that many listeners interpreted them as guarantees rather than general encouragements. The financial pressure wasn't only about individual donations. It also showed up in the way the ministry structured its fundraising efforts. Telethons, donation drives, and direct appeals during broadcasts often emphasized urgency. Viewers were told that giving today, giving now, would unlock blessings in their lives. The emotional music, the testimonies of others who claimed their lives had changed after giving, and the authoritative voice of Joyce Meyer all combined to create an atmosphere where saying no felt almost impossible. People didn't just feel inspired, they felt obligated. Over time, these accusations of manipulation began to erode trust. It wasn't just about the lavish spending that made headlines. It was about the stories of people who gave out of desperation and walked away feeling used. Critics labeled it spiritual exploitation, using people's faith and hope as tools to extract money. That phrase stung, because Joyce had built her entire reputation on being real and relatable, someone who spoke openly about her own pain and struggles. For her critics, the gap between her message of healing and the methods of fundraising was too wide to ignore. Supporters, of course, pushed back. Many insisted that they never felt manipulated, that giving to the ministry had been a blessing to them regardless of the outcome. They argued that Joyce had helped them find faith, overcome trauma, and live with hope, and that the money they gave was worth it for that reason alone. They pointed out that Joyce Meyer Ministries did do good work, disaster relief, prison outreach, feeding programs, and that those efforts required resources. To them, the accusations were unfair, painting a one-sided picture of a ministry that had genuinely helped millions. Still, the tension remained. The stories of financial pressure and manipulation lingered, amplified by the images of wealth that surrounded Joyce. Every time a report came out about a new property, a luxury item, or the ministry's massive income, it reignited the debate. Were people giving to God's work, or were they funding a lifestyle? And even if the ministry did do good work, was it right to ask people on the edge of poverty to give while the leader lived like royalty? The controversy revealed a larger issue that went beyond Joyce Meyer. It highlighted the vulnerability of people in desperate situations, people who were looking for hope and willing to give whatever they had if they thought it would bring relief. It showed how easily the line between encouragement and manipulation can blur when money and faith are mixed, and it left a lingering question that still hangs in the air. When a ministry thrives on donations, how do you know where faith ends and pressure begins? When the headlines about Joyce Meyer's wealth and spending hit the public, the shock was immediate. People who had watched her on television for years, who had read her books and gone to her conferences, suddenly felt like they were seeing a different side of her. The homes, the jet, the lavish furniture, these things didn't line up with the sermons about humility, faith, and trusting God over material wealth. For many, the image of Joyce Meyer as a relatable and down-to-earth teacher began to crack. And once cracks form, it is hard to put things back together the same way. In the middle of the uproar, Joyce decided not to hide. Unlike some other televangelists who flat-out refused to cooperate with the Senate investigation, she chose a different path. She handed over financial documents, opened up parts of the ministry's records, and even admitted that some things could have been done differently. This move surprised many. Some saw it as a sign of honesty. Others thought it was simply damage control. Still, it set her apart from others who continued to dodge questions about money. Joyce also made changes to how she handled her income. She announced that her salary would no longer come from ministry donations, but instead from her personal book royalties and other business ventures. It was her way of saying she wanted to avoid even the appearance of conflict. She admitted that she understood why people were upset and why some questioned the ministry's choices. For someone who had built her brand on boldness, admitting regret wasn't easy, but Joyce did it anyway. In interviews years later, she even went further, saying she no longer agreed with everything she had once taught about prosperity and giving. It was a rare moment of vulnerability, a preacher admitting she had grown and changed. But by then, the damage had already been done for many of her critics. Transparency and regret didn't erase the years of luxury spending, the testimonies from people who gave beyond their means, or the image of a preacher living like a celebrity while telling others to let go of worldly attachments. For those who had once trusted her without question, the sense of betrayal ran deep. They couldn't look at her sermons the same way anymore. The words were there, but the weight behind them was gone. And yet, Joyce didn't disappear. She kept preaching, writing, and filling arenas. Her message still reached millions, and for some, her willingness to admit mistakes made her seem more human. she wasn't perfect, and maybe that made her more relatable than ever. But for others, the legacy was permanently shaken. Instead of being remembered only as a survivor who turned trauma into ministry, she would also be remembered as a symbol of the prosperity gospel era, an era marked by wealth, excess, and controversy. In the end, Joyce Meyer's story became a complicated mix of inspiration and caution. She helped countless people find healing, but she also left behind questions that never fully went away. Was she a woman who simply got caught up in the trappings of success and later realized her mistakes? Or was she someone who built an empire on the backs of desperate believers and only showed regret when the spotlight turned harsh? The truth, as with most legacies, lies somewhere in between. What is clear is that transparency and regret did little to fully repair the trust that had been lost, leaving her legacy forever marked by both her words of hope and the shadow of controversy.